The battlefield was chaos. Smoke curled into the sky, mixing with the acrid scent of gunpowder and scorched earth. Sergeant Daniel Reeve pressed his back against a crumbling wall, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. His unit had been ambushed, cut off from reinforcements, and now scattered across the ruined city. Somewhere in the distance, the deep rumble of an explosion sent a shockwave through the ground. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow and scanned the street ahead. The enemy patrol had moved on, but he didn't have long before they returned. He needed to find a way out. Then, he heard it, a faint cry for help. Daniel turned sharply, eyes narrowing as he spotted a figure slumped against the rubble a few meters away. It was a civilian, or at least, someone who wasn't dressed in military gear. A man, older, his face bloodied, his leg trapped under a fallen metal beam. Daniel hesitated. He should keep moving. His orders were clear: regroup at the extraction point. But leaving a defenseless man behind didn't sit right with him. Gritting his teeth, he sprinted toward the injured stranger. "Hang in there," he said, gripping the edge of the beam and straining to lift it. The metal groaned, but he managed to shove it aside. The man gasped, eyes flickering open. His gaze, sharp despite his injuries, locked onto Daniel. "You shouldn't have stopped," he muttered. "I don't leave people behind," Daniel replied. He pulled the man to his feet, slinging one of his arms over his shoulder. They had to move now, but as Daniel helped him toward a safer alleyway, he felt something unsettling. The stranger wasn't panicked. In fact, he carried himself with a quiet intensity, despite his injuries, as if he was no ordinary civilian. Then, the gunfire came. A squad of enemy soldiers rounded the corner, weapons raised. Daniel barely had time to react before the man he was helping suddenly sprang to life. With a speed that defied his wounds, the stranger twisted free of Daniel's grasp, yanked a concealed knife from his boot, and lunged. In the blink of an eye, 3 soldiers lay motionless on the ground. The rest hesitated, stunned, before the man grabbed a fallen rifle and turned the tide in a brutal display of efficiency. Within seconds, the ambush was over. Daniel could only stare. He had seen skilled fighters before, but this was something else. The way the man moved, the calculated precision of his attacks, this was no ordinary civilian. The stranger exhaled, lowering the rifle. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, soldier." Daniel steadied his grip on his own weapon. "Who the hell are you?" The man gave a weary smirk, wiping blood from his brow. "Once, they called me General Kale. But these days I'm just a ghost." Daniel's breath caught. Kale. The name wasn't just familiar, it was legendary. A war hero turned outlaw, presumed dead for years. Some believed he had defected. Others swore he had been betrayed by his own government. Either way, he was a man spoken of in hushed voices, a figure of myth. And Daniel had just saved his life. Before he could respond, another explosion rocked the city. Kale grimaced and turned to Daniel. "If you want to live, you're coming with me. There's more to this war than you know, soldier." Daniel tightened his grip on his rifle. This was supposed to be just another mission, but now, he was caught in something far greater. With one last look at the bodies on the ground, he made his choice. Lead the way. And with that, Sergeant Daniel Reeve stepped into the legend. Daniel followed Kale through the ruins, moving fast despite the weight of his own exhaustion. His mind was still spinning. He had heard stories of General Kale, the kind that veterans whispered over drinks in dimly lit bars. A decorated war hero who had won impossible battles. A man who vanished years ago, leaving behind only rumors and unanswered questions. And now he was here, bleeding but very much alive, leading Daniel deeper into the crumbling city. "Where are we going?" Daniel asked, keeping his rifle at the ready. Kale didn't glance back. "Away from the people who just tried to kill us." They turned down an alley, stepping over debris. The war had torn the city apart, reducing it to little more than a skeleton of what it once was. Daniel glanced up. The sky was dark with smoke, the air thick with the scent of fire and gunpowder. Kale moved with purpose, his steps sure even in the chaos. "There's an underground passage not far from here. It leads to an old resistance hideout." Daniel frowned. "Resistance? You mean?" Before he could finish, a bullet ricocheted off the wall just inches from his head. "Move," Cale barked. Daniel dove behind cover as another barrage of gunfire erupted from above. A sniper. Cale yanked a smoke grenade from his belt, pulling the pin and hurling it into the open street. Thick, gray fog billowed up, obscuring their movements. Cale didn't wait. He grabbed Daniel's arm and yanked him toward a rusted metal door half hidden behind fallen debris. With a grunt, he forced it open, revealing a dark stairwell. "Down," Cale ordered. Daniel hesitated only for a second before plunging into the darkness. Cale followed, slamming the door shut behind them. They descended quickly, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. At the bottom, Cale activated a flashlight, illuminating a tunnel that stretched into the shadows. It smelled damp, the walls lined with old cables and rusting pipes. Daniel exhaled. "You mind telling me why the hell the enemy is hunting you like a rabid dog?" Cale chuckled dryly. "Because I know things they don't want getting out." Daniel folded his arms. "Try me." Cale studied him for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, he spoke. "This war isn't what you think it is. The government you fight for? It's hiding something. The real reason this war started. The people pulling the strings. I found out the truth." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "And what truth is that?" Cale took a step closer. "That we were never supposed to win." The words hit like a bullet. Daniel shook his head. "That's insane." Cale smirked. "Is it? Ask yourself, Sergeant. How many battles have you fought where you were sent in underprepared? How many times have you lost good soldiers to orders that didn't make sense?" Daniel clenched his jaw, because the truth was, he had. Too many times. "I tried to expose them," Cale continued. "But the moment I got too close, I became a target. They branded me a traitor, erased my name from the records, and sent their best killers after me." Daniel exhaled. "So, what now? You keep running?" Cale's expression hardened. "No. I find proof. I end this war." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Daniel wasn't sure what he had walked into, but he knew one thing. If even half of what Cale said was true, then everything he had fought for was a lie. Footsteps echoed in the tunnel above them. Cale's eyes snapped up. "Looks like we're not alone." Daniel raised his rifle, adrenaline spiking. The footsteps above grew louder. Daniel steadied his breath, gripping his equipment. Whoever was up there wasn't searching randomly. They knew exactly where to look. Cale pressed his back against the tunnel wall, his expression calm but focused. Even with injuries, he moved with the confidence of someone who had been in this situation before. Daniel whispered, "How many?" Cale listened for a moment. 3, maybe 4. "They're professionals." Daniel glanced at the narrow corridor ahead. "If we stay here, we won't have anywhere to go." Cale nodded. "There's an exit through an old storage passage up ahead. If we reach it in time, we can avoid them." They moved quickly but quietly. The tunnel twisted, the air damp and stale. The war had long abandoned this place, leaving only the echoes of what once was. Then, from behind them, a voice called out, "Cale." Daniel turned sharply. The voice was calm, almost familiar, but something about it sent a chill through him. Cale had stopped in his tracks, his posture tense. A man emerged from the dim light. He was tall, dressed in dark tactical gear. His presence carried a quiet authority, the kind that came with experience. A thin scar traced his cheek, and his sharp gaze locked onto Cale with an almost amused expression. "Didn't think I'd find you so soon," the man said. "After all these years, you're getting predictable." Cale exhaled. "Still persistent, Ro?" Daniel glanced between them. "You know him?" Cale's jaw tightened. "Ro isn't just any operative. He's a specialist. When they send him, it's because they want something finished quickly." Ro smirked. "And you're still running." He took a slow step forward. "You know why I'm here. This doesn't have to be difficult." Cale's stance shifted. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing." Before Daniel could react, Ro moved. His speed was startling. One moment he was standing still, the next he was in motion. Cale dodged swiftly, deflecting a strike with a fluid motion. It wasn't just strength. It was skill, precise and controlled. Daniel stepped back, uncertain whether to intervene. He knew firing his weapon would alert everyone nearby. The two moved in a rapid exchange, testing each other, neither gaining the upper hand. Cale used the narrow tunnel to his advantage, keeping Roe from gaining full momentum. Daniel saw his moment. He reached for Cale's gear and pulled out a small tool, a compact but effective deterrent device. With a flick of his wrist, he activated it, sending out a sharp pulse of light. Roe flinched, momentarily disoriented. That second was all Cale needed. With a precise motion, he shifted Roe's momentum and stepped back. Daniel didn't wait for another chance. Go. They pushed through the storage room door, shutting it behind them and securing it with a heavy steel bar. A moment later, Roe's voice carried through the other side. This isn't over. Cale took a deep breath. No, it's not. Daniel glanced at him. What happens when he gets through that door? Cale met his gaze, steady and resolved. Then we find another way. The pounding against the door grew louder, each strike sending vibrations through the rusted metal. Daniel stepped back, glancing at Cale, who was already scanning the room for an exit. The dim light flickered, casting long shadows over the dust-covered crates and abandoned machinery. They'll get through eventually, Daniel said, keeping his voice low. Cale moved to a side wall, running his hands over the uneven stone. They will. But not before we're gone. Daniel frowned. I don't see another way out. Cale found what he was looking for. A thin gap in the wall, almost invisible beneath layers of dust and grime. With effort, he pried at the stone until a section of it gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel. Stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of damp earth and old metal. This leads to an old supply passage, Cale said. We'll have to move fast. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before following him inside. The tunnel was barely wide enough for them to move single file, and the walls pressed in tightly. The only sound was their breathing and the distant pounding from the storage room. They moved quickly, their steps careful but urgent. The tunnel twisted and sloped downward, leading them deeper underground. Daniel couldn't tell how far they had gone, but eventually, the passage opened into a wider chamber. Rusted pipes lined the ceiling, and a grated drain ran along the floor. Cale moved to an old access panel on the wall and flipped a few switches. A faint hum filled the air as dim emergency lights flickered on, casting the room in a sickly yellow glow. Daniel exhaled, adjusting his grip on his rifle. So what now? We keep running? Cale didn't answer immediately. He leaned against a nearby crate, rolling his injured shoulder. The fight with Roe had cost him more energy than he let on. They won't stop, Cale finally said. As long as I'm alive, they'll keep coming. Daniel studied him. You said you know something. Something they don't want getting out. What is it? Cale met his gaze, eyes sharp but tired. The war isn't what it seems. The people we're fighting, the reasons we're given, none of it is real. Daniel's stomach tightened. He had spent years on the battlefield, following orders, watching good soldiers die for a cause they were told was just. But something in Cale's voice made him uneasy. Then what is real? Cale hesitated, choosing his words carefully. There's a hidden directive. A plan set in motion long before this war officially started. They don't want victory. They want control. And they're willing to sacrifice entire cities to get it. Daniel swallowed hard. You have proof? Cale nodded. Enough to burn them to the ground. That's why they want me dead. The weight of those words settled heavily between them. Daniel wasn't sure what he had expected when he pulled Cale out of that ambush, but it hadn't been this. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel behind them. Cale pushed himself upright. We need to move. Daniel raised his rifle, his body tensed. How many? Cale listened. Too many to fight head-on. A metallic clank rang out as something was tossed into the chamber. Daniel barely had time to register what it was before Cale grabbed him and pulled him behind cover. A flashbang detonated, flooding the space with white-hot light. Ears ringing, vision blurred, Daniel forced himself to move. Figures in dark combat gear stormed into the chamber, their movements precise and methodical. Cale grabbed his arm. We're not winning this fight. There's another way out. Daniel followed him through a side passage, adrenaline pumping. Behind them, shouts filled the air as the squad moved in, their boots striking against the metal floor. They sprinted through the corridor, taking sharp turns, navigating the maze-like underground network. Kale led with certainty, never hesitating. Up ahead, a heavy steel hatch came into view. Kale reached it first, gripping the wheel and twisting hard. The mechanism groaned, reluctant to move, but with a final push, it unlocked. Cold air rushed in as the hatch swung open, revealing a hidden escape route leading up to the surface. Daniel climbed first, emerging into an abandoned industrial lot. The city skyline loomed in the distance, the glow of searchlights sweeping across the buildings. Kale followed, sealing the hatch behind them. We won't have long before they track us. Daniel scanned the area. Then where do we go? Kale's gaze was distant, calculating. To the one place they never expected me to return. Daniel tightened his grip on his rifle as Kale led him through the industrial lot, keeping low behind rusted storage containers and broken machinery. The air was thick with the scent of oil and rain-soaked concrete. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of drones patrolling the city sent a low vibration through the ground. They'll be looking for us everywhere, Daniel muttered, scanning the darkened skyline. Where exactly are we going? Kale didn't slow down. A place I swore I'd never return to. But if we want to end this, we need what's there. Daniel wasn't sure he liked the sound of that, but there was no time to argue. The escape hatch wouldn't keep Rose's team distracted for long. Kale led them to a crumbling wall along the edge of the industrial district. Beyond it, the city loomed. A mix of towering skyscrapers and forgotten ruins, stitched together with neon lights and shadows. Daniel exhaled. We're heading into the city? Kale nodded. Not just anywhere. The undermarket. Daniel tensed. The undermarket wasn't just dangerous. It was a place where secrets had a price. Information brokers, ex-military defectors, and people who had vanished from official records years ago all found sanctuary there. If Kale had ties to it, that meant his past was even messier than Daniel had assumed. They moved quickly, sticking to side streets and alleys. Kale navigated with precision, never pausing, as if he had memorized the city's veins long ago. Daniel followed, the weight of uncertainty settling deeper with every step. The undermarket entrance was hidden beneath an old train station, its gates long rusted shut. Kale led them through a narrow passage that wound beneath the surface, where the air grew heavier with the scent of damp stone and electricity. At the bottom, the world changed. Dim lighting flickered over a sprawling underground hub, where vendors traded in hushed voices, and figures in dark coats whispered over glowing data pads. People walked with purpose, their faces half hidden beneath hoods and masks. The hum of encrypted transmissions filled the air. Kale moved with familiarity, cutting through the crowd until he reached a reinforced metal door. He knocked once, then twice, in a specific rhythm. The door slid open, revealing a dimly lit room lined with old monitors and tangled wires. Inside sat a man with silver implants running along his temples, his eyes scanning rapidly across floating data streams. He smirked when he saw Kale. Well, I never thought I'd see your face again. Kale stepped inside. No time for reunions, Dex. I need access to the old records. The ones they tried to erase. Dex leaned back, folding his arms. You really don't do small favors, do you? Kale didn't smile. This isn't about favors. It's about finishing what they started. Dex studied him for a moment before sighing. You're lucky I owe you. Give me a minute. As Dex worked, Daniel leaned toward Kale. What exactly are we looking for? Kale's gaze was steady. Proof. Of everything. Names, dates, the truth they buried. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. And what do we do once we have it? Kale's expression hardened. We burn them to the ground.